Ideas did not storm the beaches of Normandy. Democracy did not storm the beaches of Normandy. Men did. American men did. Our Constitution didn't win us the war. People did. So yesterday, June 6th, was the anniversary of D-Day, which is one of the greatest stories in the history of America and the world. America's overall triumph in World War II is seen as a proud part of our history. Many would say it marks our apex as a civilization. However, I would argue that bad actors have wrongly and inaccurately abused the legacy of World War II as a means to justify things that the war was never really about. On one hand, I would argue that neoliberals and neocons have both used the legacy of World War II to justify an American empire in the name of democracy. They do this using the lie that America's involvement in World War II had anything to do with democracy or ideology in general, yet this is just not true. Simultaneously, and perhaps connected to that, I'd argue that the left abuses the boogeyman of Hitler and Nazism to wrongly demonize any and all right-wing ideas that actually have nothing to do with Nazism at all. As one example, they'll use the image of Hitler to demonize any concept of nationalism, despite the fact that America's very involvement in World War II was driven by a sense of American nationalism. Maybe this is a little bit confusing now, but in this video, I'm going to kill two liberal arguments with one stone by arguing that America's involvement in World War II was not driven by ideology. America did not get involved in World War II to spread liberal democracy around the globe. Rather, America fought World War II in defense of her nation, her people, and her civilization. And that's what World War II most fundamentally was about. A clash of nations more so than a clash of ideas. Again, this distinction matters because of the way in which the narrative of ideas has been used to spread an ideology around the world that the men who stormed the beaches of Normandy fundamentally were not fighting for. So we're going to explain that in today's video, but first be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you're new. Okay, let's do it. So anyways, enough chit chat. Let's get into this by first explaining why America did not get involved in World War II to advance or defend democracy. If that were the case, we would have entered the war the moment that Nazi troops crossed into Poland and suspended the Polish democracy. We would have stopped the Japanese Empire at their first signs of expansion. They didn't exactly give democracy to their conquered peoples, as we know. If Americans really believed that their duty as a nation was to defend liberal hegemony around the world, we would have stepped in and done so right away. Yet this is, of course, wildly inaccurate. As I'm sure you've learned in school, the very concept of America intervening in the war was highly unpopular prior to Pearl Harbor. Americans did not believe it was their job to defend global democracy because that's not who America was or ever has been. It's very simple. Rather, America entered World War II because she was attacked by Japan in the Pacific, and she entered the war in Europe because Hitler declared war on her. She fought the war in self-defense of her nation and her homeland. The intent of the Americans who stormed Omaha Beach was to defend their nation, not to build some type of global empire for democracy or something. The context of why and how America entered the war shows that this is objectively true, right? We fought the war because we were attacked, not because of any necessarily ideological reasons. But if you're not convinced on the ideological front, there's a very easy way to prove that World War II wasn't really about ideology like the way you're taught in school. And that's the fact that the Western Allies teamed up with the Communist Soviet Union to take on the German National Socialists. If World War II were really a war over ideology, Western allies would not team up with an ideology that was the mortal enemy of their civilization to take on an ideology that, while they didn't exactly agree with, was less ideologically opposed to them than communism. And that's just the truth. And okay, I know this is the part of the video that journalists will choose to take wildly out of context sooner or later, so let me be clear when I say that I don't have sympathy for Nazism, nor is my prior comment meant to suggest that I think Nazism is somehow ideologically aligned with the traditional Western values that I lean towards. In fact, as I have argued in past live streams and will argue again, Nazism is not conservative. Nazism may borrow some aspects of right-wing thought like order and hierarchy, but it fundamentally rejects Christianity, it is godless, and one could argue in some ways it actually rejects tradition. Now, I am a Christian conservative whose ideology is based in a belief in God and a respect for tradition. Of course, that won't matter to the libtards. They're still going to call me a Nazi anyway, but I still think that this is a relevant conversation to have for a number of reasons, and I think it's quite interesting because establishing that I am a Christian and our civilization is historically Christian, let us remember that most of the Nazi arguments on race came from the perspective of atheism and scientific materialism, right? Nazis frequently justified their racial policies not through God or Christianity or the Bible, but rather through the lens of evolution and natural selection. Let us remember that things like eugenics, social Darwinism, and race-based natural selection were seen as the progressive ideas of the time, hence why many progressives in America actually sympathized with Nazi ideology, by the way. Now, the Nazis rejected God and believed that they were justified by science. That actually sounds kind of familiar, but anyways, as documented by Albert Speer and others, Hitler famously hated Christianity and openly intended to destroy it after he was done with Judaism. Some will point out, right, that Hitler occasionally said positive things about Christianity in the public eye as proof that actually Hitler was some type of Christian nationalist, but we need to understand that that was really more optics than anything else. See, he understood that he was the leader of a European nation, and he would have to publicly support Christianity to build his party up in the early years. So of course, while you're climbing to power in a European country, you're going to make some type of appeal to Christians and Christianity. But it is well documented that Hitler actually hated our faith. He believed that Christianity made his people soft, as a matter of fact. He persecuted Christians on many occasions. He thought religion in general was ridiculous, and he ultimately wanted to get rid of it in the long term. And we could also get into how many Nazis were actually European pagans because they thought that Christianity was a Jewish psyop imposed on Europe, which is a belief that actually transcends into modern neo-Nazi groups of today, by the way. But honestly, the easiest way to argue this is to simply point out that Nazi ideas are not Christian. They do not even come from an ideological foundation that believes in God. They put race over faith, and therefore they cannot be labeled conservative. A conservative seeks to conserve the values that built Western civilization. Those values come from Christianity. So sure, the Nazis may have dog-whistled about things like restoring the old Germany, but what they were fundamentally trying to build was a godless, twisted perversion of that, which rejected the values that built German civilization to begin with. There is no better person who can explain this than the old German monarch himself, who notoriously hated Hitler. Kaiser Wilhelm II famously said about Hitler, quote, "There is a man alone, without family, without children, without God. He builds legions, but he doesn't build a nation. A nation is created by families, a religion, tradition. It is made up out of the hearts of mothers, the wisdom of fathers, the joy and the exuberance of children. Germany under Hitler is an all-swallowing state, disdainful of human dignities, and the ancient structure of our race sets itself up in place of everything else. And the man who alone incorporates in himself this whole state has neither a God to honor, nor a dynasty to conserve, nor a past to consult. This man could bring home victories to our people each year without bringing them glory. But of our Germany, which was a nation of poets and musicians and artists and soldiers, he has made a nation of hysterics and hermits, engulfed in a mob and led by 1,000 liars or fanatics." It's so true. What a based quote, and unironically, from a conservative perspective, probably the best take on Nazism that you will ever hear. The feeling was mutual, by the way, as Hitler also had contempt for the old German monarchy and had no intentions of restoring the old system. So So again, not exactly the most conservative or traditional, right? This is obviously not to say that Nazism is like left-wing because big government, or, oh, they use the word socialist, therefore they're like left-wing socialists. Okay, that's a ridiculous cliche. But with that said, a proper understanding shows us that Nazism is not really right-wing either, right? It's basically like third positionist, which is what some people call it. It borrows some right-wing concepts of order and hierarchy and some traditions, but it also borrows things like godlessness and scientific materialism from the left. And so this is all to clarify, okay, that I'm not saying that Nazism was exactly aligned with historical Western civilization. Again, I don't think that Nazism is conservative. But with that said, it is relevant to note that communism is and always has been the ideology more alien and more opposed to Western civilization. Because where Nazism is godless and material, communism is far more godless and more material. And this was a unanimous consensus in America at the time, by the way. Through the 20s and 30s, Americans always saw the Soviet Union as the greater ideological enemy. There's a reason why 1920s America had a Red Scare and not a fascist scare. Okay, Nazi sympathizers were far less persecuted in America than Russian sympathizers for a reason, because a communist takeover was truly what most Americans and most Westerners actually feared. Why? Because communism is and always has been a far greater opponent to Western civilization than Nazism. And that's clearly not me sympathizing with Nazism, right? I just explained for like 3 minutes why I don't believe Nazism is conservative, but it is to say that if World War II were truly a war over ideology, we would have fought against the Soviets. That's a fact. But instead we teamed up with our mortal ideological enemy to fight a lesser enemy. Now, there are conservatives, by the way, who will argue that World War II actually should have been fought against the Soviets, against the communists, or they'll dispute America's involvement in the war as unnecessary to begin with. I'm not even here to make a comment on that necessarily. I think that's a debate for another time. But it's just simply to say, right, that a truly ideological war would have been fought against the Russians. Why does this matter? Well, first and foremost, it matters because the globalists have rewritten our victory in the war to justify a global crusade for democracy and supposedly American ideology. They believe that America was advancing democracy in World War II and advancing ideas rather than simply defending her nation. And therefore, every time that a foreign dictator is oppressive towards their people or starts expanding their territory, neocons will immediately label it as America's duty to intervene on behalf of our principles. How many times have you heard it said about Iraq or Ukraine or wherever that this is just like World War II? Oh, Putin wants Donbass? This is just like Hitler taking the Rhineland. No, it's not. And the crusade for democracy narrative is used extensively to justify us getting involved in conflicts that have nothing to do with us, but supposedly have some type of ideological component that we disagree with, right? Neocons will say that every single new foreign intervention will be just as glorious as like defeating Germany in World War II. But again, they're just wrong. Right? World War II was a defense of our nation, not an offense of our ideas. See what I'm saying? And secondly, we must discuss the way in which the left utilizes the big lie of World War II to discredit conservatism. What they'll firstly do is associate Nazi ideology with conservatism, which we already explained is untrue, but still, they'll associate the two, right? And then they'll use the evils of Hitler as a boogeyman to discredit authentically right-wing ideals. For one, they'll use the connotation of Hitler to discredit any concept of an American nationalism. This is despite the fact that, properly understood, as we basically just kind of made the argument towards that, we could make the argument that World War II was actually a war for American nationalism on our part. But again, you can only make that argument if you understand that World War II was really a war of nation and not a war of ideas. And this is why they tell you that the war was about ideas. See how that works? You'll also notice how they'll subtly shift the goalposts to kind of legitimize communism in the process. Because as we established earlier in this video, Nazism isn't good, but communism, right, is the true mortal enemy of everything our civilization stands for. Yet this is not how we are taught. Instead, we are taught that Hitler was the single most evil man to ever exist, despite the fact that many communist dictators killed far more people than Hitler did. We are taught that World War II was a grand moral crusade to destroy the most evil ideology on the planet, despite the fact that we teamed up with Stalin and the communists in the process, and that doesn't really make sense if we're trying to take down the most evil ideology, right? So do you see what's going on here? They are using World War II to shift the goalposts. They have replaced communism with fascism as being the true mortal enemy of civilization, and they are using that to discredit right-wing ideas and legitimize leftism in the process. And it's easy for most people to believe that because, after all, right, we fought the big war against fascism and not communism, right? Because, like, sure, the Cold War happened, the Red Scare happened, but the powerful imagery and the constant history lessons are really about that big war against fascism and not those little proxy wars and nuclear scares against communism, right? Therefore, fascism must be the true enemy. You see how that works? This is why you have to stop believing that World War II was really a battle of ideas. Firstly, because it's inaccurate, and secondly, because it enables the people who are trying to take down our civilization. So with that said, how should World War II be taught? Because regardless of how you feel about our involvement, do you think it was justified? Do you think it was avoidable? It did happen, and I truly believe that understanding that it did happen, it is a great story for our civilization. Objectively, right? We don't have to get rid of the images of Normandy and Iwo Jima from our national story. I do think those stories have to be told. All we have to do is tell them accurately. We can teach kids that World War II really started like most other wars do. It was not this war to end all wars. It really was a conflict of national interests, territorial disputes, and complicated geopolitics, not much different from how most wars start. And America was dragged into the war, and she prevailed. Not because of the superiority of democracy, per se, but because of the superiority of American manufacturing and the fighting spirit of the American people. Ideas did not storm the beaches of Normandy. Democracy did not storm the beaches of Normandy. Men did. American men did. Why? Because that's us. Because that's who we are as a people and as a nation. And that's something to be proud of. That's the reason why we ought to believe in each other. And honestly, what more patriotic way to tell children the story of World War II than that? That it is a story of the conquest and the glory of the American people and our country. It's also the truth. Our Constitution didn't win us the war. People did. People like my great-grandfather on my dad's side, and I'm sure a lot of your relatives too, they fought the war. And it is honestly much more respectful to give the veterans of World War II the credit and not, abstract ideas that the war actually had nothing to do with. So let us remember D-Day in World War II in a way that is actually more symbolic and more representative of America's identity. America is a nation of people, not an empire of ideas. America is a nation of strong and proud people that will stick up for themselves when necessary, and we will fight when necessary, but we also are not a nation of imperialists or globalists. Lastly, let us remember that America is a Christian and Western civilization. Therefore, the greatest enemies of these two things are the greatest enemies of American civilization. And with that said, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for watching. I hope this was an insightful video. Very important conversation in my opinion. Some people might say, what's the utility of this conversation? I actually think it's pretty important when we understand the way in which they abuse the legacy of World War II to basically rewrite America and what it means to be an American. It's actually very important. So, I know we were floating around the idea of this video for a while, so I'm glad we finally did it. Finally got it off the chest. I don't think it's all that controversial, if I'm being honest. Okay? Like, I know people are going to say, they're going to take the whole me saying that communism is like worse than Nazism thing and just go crazy with that, but it's objectively true. Okay? It's objectively the case. So yeah, subscribe if you're new. Alpha moves only. God bless and peace.
Americanism, not globalism, will be our credo as long